Dear students, very warm welcome to University of Southern Punjab online learning. As you know, you are studying with me the classical poetry module, and today we shall be talking about its history. And when we say history, we mean two things. Number one, what is the timing in which this classical poetry started? And secondly, we shall be discussing the developments, what developments took place when this poetry thing started, which we call classical poetry. We know very well that literary canons were already present when we talk of the Roman poetry and the Greek poetry. The great poets like Horace, like Virgil, like Homer, these poets were already present. And from there, this classical poetry actually begins because they are the starters of this type of poetry. And with the passage of time, this poetry has come to the West, where number of poets try to polish it and try to improve it. So in that way, it begins with the 14th century and ultimately reached to its end at the 18th century when poetry was called New Classical Poetry. So in that way, what is happening actually, that with the passage of time, time is also changing and the developments are also changing. You know, these developments are mostly performed by the English poets, and the big names in this regard are Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare, John Milton, and Alexander Pope. All of these people in their respective ages gave something new to the poetry. For example, if we talk about Chaucer, he's the one who started the poetry, classical poetry. Of course, he took the model from these people whose names again and again come before you, like Homer, like Virgil, Ovid, and Horace, but he included his own development in that as well. You know, Chaucer is termed as the father of English poetry. In his age, English language was not that developed. Most of the writings were in French language, but he's the one who started in English. Whatever the English he writes, if you find it, you will feel and find different spells, different pronunciations, different nomenclatures of different things. So in that way, Chaucer is responsible for creating the poetry for the English people. And in his poetry, therefore, he introduced number of things. But before we understand what did he introduce, we need to know that Chaucer is a person who created a bridge between medieval ages and the Renaissance ages, because his poetry is filled up with medieval content, I mean the content which he took from the Greek people, and the English content, the French content as well. That is why it's a kind of bridging the gap between the medieval age and then the Renaissance age. In this regard, the example of one very famous book from him can be taken. That was the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. And that is, here we find the innovation introduced by him. And that was the iambic pentameters which he introduced. These were heroic couplet forms. That means in the end of the lines of poetry, the ending was rhymed. The rhymed couplet form that was introduced by him. Chaucer took it from Boccaccio or from Greek mythology and bridged it according to his own style, and as a result, he introduced this kind of innovation in him. Although he's got his own poetic diction as well, but then we can say that because of Renaissance, he refined this poetic diction also. So you can see that Chaucer is responsible for this kind of activity. And as soon as we move a little further, we come to the age of Renaissance. Renaissance is the age, characterized by something called humanist movement. Or one can say that human being became more important in that age. The change of this humanist movement was that first the people, or the poets definitely, talked about the goddesses and the kind of genie or the fairies. Most of the things were talked about, but Chaucer didn't talk about that. He talked about the human being. It means human being became more the important topic, or one can say topic of discussion that the poets would do, and as a result, there's a big, huge contribution to this poetry by Chaucer. Next, if we move on to Shakespeare, Shakespeare, although followed 100% the style, the formation, the structure of the Greek people, but he introduced something new into the poetry, and that was vernacular style. I think my students may be knowing vernacular style. That means the style which is used by the common people in English language, in English-speaking country. That is vernacular kind of creativity and language he brought and introduced this kind of thing in his sonnets. Besides this, not only introduced this vernacular tongue, but also he introduced something in his poetry that was related to Plato. Plato and Aristotle have different views of love. Plato says that love should be for the sake of love. It should not be for the sake of physical activity. So that is why he brought this kind of thing. Under this concept, Shakespeare gave full weight to the body of the beloved, the love of the beloved, and the praise and admiration of the beloved. So in a way, he resembled more with the Horatian tradition, that means taken from Horace, the Greek poet, and Aristotelian tradition, and made them an excellent combination to create beauty in his poetry. So in that way, here is a contribution of Shakespeare as well. This contribution you can see not only in his poetry, but also in his dramas, like Julius Caesar, for example, King Lear, for example. If you read all that, you will find these kind of things in his dramas as well. So in this way, we can proceed further what history did with the next person, that is John Milton. And you know, if you look at the years, you find 1608 to 1674, that means the 17th century, just 100 years before the 18th century. But here, when we see that 17th century has started and 18th century will come after that, 18th century is the new classical age. It means in the 17th century, classical age will reach its maximum highest possible point. And that is why Milton becomes the most important person with regard to two things, that he talks about Christian interpretation of the poetry or that of the ideologies, but along with that, he also introduces something new, and that is bringing in the moralistic element into that. Although he follows Virgil and Homer, as these were the kind of poets who wrote epic poetry, he follows them definitely, but then he introduces his own way of talking the poetic things, that means bringing the kind of words or the diction of poetry, which was more important and suitable to him as well. For example, you might have noticed one word on the very first page of Paradise Lost, that was invoking the muse, M-U-S-E, muse. That was done by Homer, that was done by Virgil. Both of these poets who were the epic poetry writers, they introduced this kind of thing in their poetry, that is inviting the muse to help. Milton also, in his poetry, introduces the same muse. It means that partially Milton is following still the Greek people or the classical poetry people. That is why we call his poetry classical. But then he introduced something new as well. And that new thing definitely became the basis for making his style of poetry as the grand style. In some next lecture, we should be talking about the grand style. But right now, the developments which are taking place in his poetry, Milton's contribution is like that. And if we just proceed ahead, we reach something new in the 18th century, which is called Neoclassical age. Well, it is classical, but it is new classical. Now, what was the reason behind that? The reason was that Pope introduced also something new from him. His age is called Augustan age also. His age is called age of reason also, that with the help of his mind, he not only revived the classic literature format, but also introduced something into it with his own form. I think you can remember here a word which frequently you find in different lectures in the books, that is the mock epic style of poetry. That Pope was able to create realism in his poetry as he witnessed in his society. What he saw, he brought it in and told to the people what is going on. So in this way, he took the form of the classical poetry, but talk about the urban things which were happening around him, and he brought all that into his poetry. Wrote, of course, in a very scholarly style. He revived all those traditions, but then brought something which is definitely a good one for the reader to find. And this provided a change also. And that change was from the classical form of poetry to the new classical form of poetry. And further, it became romantic style of poetry in the next century. So Pope is also responsible for this kind of activity. And so you can see there was the deliberate revival of poetry by Pope, along with the new classical spirit which he introduced in his poetry. He also used, like Chaucer, heroic couplet formation. You know, heroic couplet was used by Chaucer also, by Pope also, but in between comes Milton. He used simply blank verse. Now, the only difference between blank verse and heroic couplet would be that in heroic couplet we have the rhymed ending, and in the blank verse we do not have rhymed ending, we say unrhymed ending of the poetry. Now, by the way, all of you may be understanding that rhymed poetry is that in which we definitely see what is the ending sound of the closing word of a line. And if the sounds resemble, For example, try, fry, etc. These sounds are resembling. We say rhymed ending of these things is taking place. But if it does not happen, we have that unrhymed. So in the hereway couplet, we have unrhymed sounds. In the blank verse, we have unrhymed sounds. In this way, this is the kind of definition or the things which were introduced by these classical poets. So in this way, the things which were suggested rather, by the poets of the Greek era, these things have also been taken up by the poets of classical age in English literature. They have taken up, but with every age, they have introduced something new into it. For example, let us repeat. Chaucer started to talk about the hereway couplet formation. He introduced this structure. Pentameter was there, but then he brought this rhymed kind of structure in his poetry. And the best formation that we can remember, that is a prologue to the Canterbury Tales that he wrote, and all of us are enjoying that. In that poem as well, he included different types of characters. Now, his characters are also different from the characters of these classical poets, because Chaucer not only talks about the prince, talks about the knight, talks about the higher cadre of society, but also he talks about the cadre which is not that higher. It may be of the middle class, but maybe different people, religious, non-religious, or the social, political people. Even he brings in doctors also, he brings in lawyers also. So in that way, he brought something new in his poetry. And it was to be enjoyed altogether with the help of irony, with the help of the humor, and that is the introduction of Chaucer into it. And after that, when we talk of Shakespeare, Shakespeare introduced vernacular tongue in his poetry. And then if we move forward one step more, we talk of the Milton. He brought moral and ethical element in it. Because of that, his poetry became more an interpretation of Christianity or Christian ideology, whatever they had. And in that way, it became more and more the poetry which would spread moral aspect of the poet, and the poetry the people will enjoy in that way. So that is why Milton is most of the time termed as a poet who is a poet of religion. And his poetry was given one name also, and that was Puritan poetry, because it also referred to the Puritan format at that time working in the England of that time. What is that, for example? We need to spend a few seconds on that. In Puritan poetry was written by the philosophy which comes from Protestant, we can say, section of Christianity. One section was Protestant, the other section was non-Protestant people. And Protestant wanted the pure religion and the purity they wanted to bring, and that is why Milton became the Puritan poet. If we proceed further for the last poet of this age, in the 18th century, he brought certain changes into it, and because of that, his poetry was called New Classical Poetry. The best example I have already told was the Rape of Lock. Here, everything becomes diminished in the diminutive size, I mean the very small size. Because of that, the poetry becomes different. But he took it and used it for a specific purpose. And the purpose was that people should enjoy on the one hand, and on the other hand, some kind of correction of the society should also take place. And the biggest contribution which Pope makes is the satirical type of style. Through satire, he pointed out the problems, the kind of bad things or unacceptable things in poetry, and he used them in order to correct them as well. So the major focus of all the poets had been, as of the Greek ages, that they brought aestheticism also, the good poetry, good scholarly poetry also, along with the element of enjoyment and the element of correction also. All these poets followed, but in their own style. So in this way, in this era of these 400 years, these type of developments took at the historical level. As the centuries passed, same thing happened with the development of these people. We can say every poet added something into it, and that thing is quite visible in his poetry, as we shall be reading with the next coming lectures as well. So far, for today, we reached to the end of our lecture. Thank you.